So we are back today and we are going to talk about facings. Now, you have three options when you're considering what to sew as a facing. We have, if you are using knit for your Laura, you can use a binding that is made with knit. This is a binding that I have cut from the same fabric as my Laura in woven, and I'm going to be showing you how to sew the binding on with a woven binding, but the Laura in knit steps are exactly the same as what we're going to do right now for this woven binding. So first things first, we're going to lay the ends of the binding right sides together, and we're just going to sew that in right here with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm just going to pin that in so it does not wiggle about as I am trying to load it onto my sewing machine. Pin that right there, and I'm going to just zip over to my sewing machine, sew this in 1/2 inch seam allowance. So here we have it, nice and done. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to run over to our ironing board, and we just want to iron that open. And the reason that we iron it open is so that we don't deal with a lot of excess bulk at the back of the neck. So just iron this open, and then we're going to come back and we're going to quarter the neckband. So we are back from the ironing board, and this is nice and open. So the first thing that we want to do is just grab one of our pins, and that will be our first point on the neckband. So after this, fold the neckband in half, and that opposite corner over here, this becomes your second point. Pop a pin down there. Perfect. Okay. So we open up the neckband the other way such that both of the pins that we just fixed in are now lying one on top of another, hence creating the other 2 points for us. So this will be our third point, and that will be our fourth point. Let's pop pins down there too. That's 3, and this is number 4. So now that we have our neckband nice and quartered, we're just going to set this aside for a moment while we do the same for our Laura dress. So we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to just quarter the neckband. First pin right over there. Put it in this way. So I put the pin in. I know you see 2 seam lines over here. Put the pin in where the actual seam is, because remember the other seam was our top stitching line. It would be very convenient for us to now put 1 pin here, 1 pin at the shoulder seam each, and 1 pin down the center, but that would not be a true representation of where the other 2 quarter points are. So I'm going to show you how to get that in a minute. The first thing that we're going to do is get the back center and the front center. So let's get this to lay nice and flat. I've got the back center over there marked. I've got my side seams here holding them together, and we get the rest of the neckline to lay flat as best we can. And this point over here, that's our center front. I'll just pin that in. Here we go. So we have our center back and our center front marked. So what we're going to do next is lay them flat, one on another, and you want to measure an equidistant of length on the left hand side and pin down there. So this is our third quarter mark, and this is where, if you have stay stitched your neckline, it would be very useful, because as you can see, we are tugging and pulling a fair bit on our neckline, and if you have not stay stitched, and if your fabric is one that is a little bit of a looser weave, this is where you will run into problems, because later when we fix in our neckband, you might find that the two pieces don't fit. So to avoid this issue, it is always a good move to stay stitch. So we do the same on the other side. Take your time with this, because your measurement matters. If you measure correctly at this step, you will find that your neckband quartered will fit onto your neckline quartered much easier. So there we have it. And as I mentioned earlier, there's our shoulder seam, and there's our quarter marking. It is, I'd say, a good 1¼ inch away from the shoulder seam. But don't take my measurement as an indicator of how far you should how far your pin should be. Always do the step, never skip the step. The reason being, on larger sizes, the distance gonna increase. So this is where the fun starts. We're going to grab our neckband, and so we're going to start at the back of our Laura, just like so, and grab the back of your neckband. So there's our center back seam, and I'm going to place this here, right sides facing, and just pin that in. So exactly the same steps as for the knit neckband. If you are doing this in knit, it's exactly the same process. So I find my way down, and there's our next pin. Just pin them together. And I repeat the same for the center front. Find my way. Oh, that pin is almost on its way out. Good thing we caught it in time. There we go. That's our center front done. And oh my other pin has fallen out, but good thing it's left a mark there. So I have an indicator of where it was, and it was just over there. That is our 4th quarter. It'll turn up, that pin. Okay. So what we want to do right now is we want to take it over to the sewing machine, and you want to sew this in with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. But before that, I'm just going to pop 2 pins, or maybe 3, between, as you go into the larger sizes, you're going to be having a larger neckline. So you may want to put 3 pins between each quarter. You may not want a pin between each quarter. That's totally up to you. As long as you have your minimum 4 quarter points, you should be good to go. But I just like a little bit of insurance just in case, like what just happened. One of my pins just flies out of its spot. At least I have some other pins holding my neckband in place. So I'm just gonna go ahead real quick and put some extra pins down. As you work with different types of fabrics, you will realize that different fabrics, even among woven fabrics, they have different degrees of stretch. And this is so even on the bias. So some types of denims, if you're making your Laura in denim, a Laura in denim looks so beautiful. We have so many testers who have done such amazing work with their Lauras, and some in denim just look amazing. And you may find that the neckband doesn't stretch as much. So what you can do in that instance is, if you want to consider doing the neckband in a different fabric, something that allows you to have the neckband sit in a neater way across the neckline, because a fabric that doesn't stretch as much is going to pull on the neckline, and having worked so hard for this beauty of a dress, that's the last thing you want. So just a point for consideration right there, the stretch of your fabric. I'm gonna zip over to my sewing machine and just sew that in with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, over at our sewing machine now. So, before we get started, most sewing machines come with a feature that allows you to remove a part of the base to get into necklines and cuffs a little bit easier. So if your machine has that feature, go ahead and do that now, because you want to be as comfortable as possible getting into the curves of the neckline. I like to start at the center back, just for purposes of hiding the seams if they come out a bit wonky, or you know, just to get my rhythm going, and so that it's not as much a public place as the front of the neckline is going to be. It's a personal thing. Everybody has their sewing quirks. I'm happy to hear about yours. If you have any sewing quirks or any special things that you do when you're sewing, just post it in the group. So we just go ahead and sew this in with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm of the opinion that a shorter stitch length gives you a greater degree of control over a curve, and you find that a lot of tutorials will recommend that you use a shorter stitch length when you are working around tight corners, like on collars or collar stands, and you know, the edge of your button plackets. So if you want to use a little bit of a shorter stitch length than we have been using throughout this tutorial, that is fine. That will just give you a greater degree of control as you work around the corners of the neckband. So as you are sewing, just remember to just feel under. So feel the fabric under as you go as well, because I notice, I don't know if you can see that, I'm feeling this. As my hand is moving the fabric across, I'm feeling this little puckers under. So, and that's perfectly normal, because you are sewing two curves together, so the fabric over here is a little bit larger. So you will just have to like ease it over and make sure that as the fabric passes under your fingers, you're feeling that it's nice and flat. And that is why you should never rush a neckband, which is also why it's good to work in segments, which allows you to work out the differences between the neckband and the neckline in gradual amounts. If you just leave it to one bunch, then there's no way that the difference in the length of these two pieces are going to match up. And we are done. So this is what we have once we're back from the sewing machine, and it's beginning to look like a lovely cowl neck, but that's not what we're after. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to trim off the excess threads that I have on the back here. And that's done. Okay. What we want to do now is take a quick trip to our ironing board. Iron the seam that we just sewed upwards towards the neckband, all around. And if you feel you'd like to, you could trim this down just a fraction of an inch. I'd say 1/8 at maximum. And what this is going to do is it's going to help you fold over for the next step. But that's when we come back. Off to the ironing board now, and I'll be back in just a second. So we're back from our ironing board, and this is looking so pretty right now. So this is what we have. We're going to turn it over to the wrong side, starting from the back, center back of the garment. Here we have it. And this is what I want to do. I'm going to take that raw edge and I'm going to fold it such that it meets the raw edge of the seam. I'm going to zoom in closer so you can have a closer look at this. So once again, I'm going to fold this over so that the raw edge of the neckband meets the raw edge of the seam. And this section will be just a wee bit smaller, and you will see why. Just a fraction of an inch shorter. So I pin this in place over here. Now this is one of those times where if you have clips, they work so much better, because a clip is just going to hold that in place without you needing to pin in this very short length. So we are going to be doing this across the entire length of the neckband. Just meet the raw edges, fold it over, clip. And here we have it. If you want, you can put in more clips or pins. The more you put, the better it holds in place as you're sewing it in. I'm happy with what I have here, so I will be going to head over to my sewing machine now, and what I want to do is I just want to sew just a little shy from my seam allowance, from my seam line here. So once again, I'm going to zoom in so you can have a little bit of a better look. This right here, that's my seam line. I will be sewing perhaps 1/8 of an inch or 1/16 of an inch, because if we flip it over to the other side, you will see that my binding is just a little bit shy of that seam line. So I want the seam that I sew now, the top stitching, to be able to catch this. Otherwise, it's gonna flap open, and that's not what I want. So once again, it's important as you are sewing just to feel your way with your finger before you sew it, before it comes under the presser foot, so you can be intuitive of how much you need to move your seam. I always say it's better to have a greater allowance for less error, so I'm going to go ahead and go with 1/8 of an inch. 1/8 of an inch. Yes, so we'll go over to our sewing machine now and get that done. Back from the ironing board, and I am in love with how this turned out. I am sure that yours turned out beautifully too. Don't forget to post your pictures in the RP Sewalongs group. Let us know how you're coming along with your neckbands, and if you have any problems, you can post there too. One of our lovely admins will be sure to jump in and help you. So I was playing around with facings one evening, and I decided that my favorite shape for a keyhole was a teardrop shape. I tried loads of other shapes, but nothing quite struck my fancy like a lovely little keyhole, teardrop keyhole, pardon me. So I have two little cutouts here, which I will be using as a template for the front of my dress in a minute. So right now we're going to be learning how to construct a teardrop shaped keyhole just by drafting it yourself. So this is what it's going to look like on the final garment, but we're not doing this using the facing piece. We will be doing the teardrop keyhole with the binding piece. So let's take a look. So here I have the front of my Laura dress. Oh my, it looks like a lovely little smiley face happening over here, doesn't it? Right, so I'm going to be turning my dress front, wrong side facing us. I'm just gonna pop these two little lovely things to the side, and here we go. So what I want to do now is I want to have the shoulder seams meet exactly together, and I'm going to take a minute to pin this in, and the reason being is I want this to be as precise as possible. The keyhole needs to be dead center. Anything askew is going to be very, very obvious. So once I've got the shoulder seams nice and lined up and pinned, I am going to make sure that the rest of my bodice front lines up exactly so. And then I'm going to pop a pin right there in the center front. Now if your fabric is one that can hold a crease well, I suggest running over to the ironing board and just giving this a nice little press for about, I'd say, the length of my teardrop facing that I've cut out there is about 2.5 inches. So don't iron too much, just a little bit for finger's length. So here I have the front of my neckline ironed with a lovely crease just down a bit of the center front, and I've gone ahead and done that for my teardrop cutout that I played around with yesterday. Now if you like the shape of this teardrop cutout, you can get it as a download from the blog post with regards to how to do a keyhole in the front neckline of a garment over at the Rebecca Page blog. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pop that there such that the very tip of the teardrop shape is at the center front of my neckline. I'm just going to grab a pin and pin this in place just so that it does not move as I am cutting. So there are two things you could do here. The first is you could be prudent and you could trace it out and then you could cut it, or you could do as I do and just grab your shears and cut it out. So holding it in place, here it goes. We did it. Okay, so here we have that very same shape cut out of the front of our Laura. So we had gone ahead and trimmed out the teardrop shape from the front of our garment. So what we're going to do right now, let's zoom in a little bit. Okay, what we're going to do right now is I'm going to go to the machine and I want to just very quickly put in a row of stay stitching all around this curve, because this curve will be stretched and I don't want it to go all wonky on me. I love this dress, I love this fabric. And so I'm just going to put in a row of stay stitching. So now that this is done, you have an option. If you wanted to, if you had wanted, you could also put in a little circle of interfacing just on the back. I'm going to skip ahead from that because I think my fabric is pretty stable. But if you are working with any of the lighter substrates of cotton, or if you are if you feel that this is your first attempt and you just want to make sure that things don't stretch out of proportion, you can go ahead and put a little circle or teardrop shape of interfacing on the back. Just be sure that if you are using the template, you want to extend it on the borders by about 1 centimeter, and that is 3/8 of an inch. So I have our neck binding for woven cut on the bias. This is one of that. And then I have this. So this is about half of the size width-wise. So this piece is very fiddly for one. Okay, so I've cut this at a 10-inch length. If you'd like, you could cut it to 12 inches. The larger the size of flora that you sew, you may want to alter your keyhole to be a bit larger or smaller. That is your choice. A larger keyhole would definitely be easier to work with. So this is roughly 10 inches long, and it is 1 inch wide. Let me just verify that. Yes, indeed it is 1 inch wide. And so what this means is that when it is folded on the quarter, it is going to be 1/4 inch in depth. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to take this over to the to the ironing board. I am going to iron it straight down the length, and then I'm going to open it up and 2 folds inwards and then iron it again. So I would have folded it in quarters. It will be very thin. It is a very delicate piece of binding, and it will be a little bit fiddly, but it will be all worth the effort. So back from the ironing board, and this is what we have. Ever so tiny and delicate. It measures in at 1/4 of an inch, and it is folded in 4s, meeting at the center. We need to open this up and take one of the folds. So if you've pressed it well, you should be able to see that there are now 3 lines running down the center entire length of your bias tape. So I only open it up by parts based on the length that I'm working with. So let's keep the rest closed and just to hold its shape. I'm a bit paranoid about that. Okay, so what I want to do is to just lay this down over the keyhole, and I want to start pinning, but I need to extend my bias tape just slightly beyond the start of your keyhole. So this is about 1 centimeter, or you could use 1/4 of an inch. So let's just start pinning that down. And don't forget that just as we left a little bit of an extension at the top of the left side, we're going to leave a little bit of an extension at the top of the right side as well. And this is important because at a later step we're going to crisscross them to join them up together. So this is all done. Now I'm going to run to my sewing machine, and we're going to stitch this down with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all around. It is useful to use that fold line just very faint fold line that you can, I'm sorry, just a very faint fold line that you can see over there. Right here. It is useful to use that as a stitching guide. That's what I do. So over to my sewing machine now. Okay, so once again a reminder that I have removed the front of my machine just so I can get into the corners a little bit better. I am using a thread that stands out just for demonstration purposes. You would be using a thread that matches your fabric. And the third thing that I want to remind you is to use a small stitch length, because we will be working around a very tight corner, and you want the curve to sit nice and curvy. So you want to use a smaller stitch length, because the larger stitch length will not be able to represent that curve just as well. So I'm going to get started. So if you'd like, you can start your stitch line from that excess fabric itself, just to get the motion going, or you could get started right there. The choice is yours. I'm going to get started from the excess fabric. Oopsie, and that's why that's important. So once again, 1/4 inch seam allowance. So looking at the wrong side of the fabric, this is what we've just sewn. It doesn't lay very flat right now because you've got all this excess of the binding over there. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to go around the corners of the curve with particular focus on this corner and this corner, and we're just going to give tiny little snips. Just ever so slight, because as we turn that bias binding over, we want to try our best not to have it pucker. So this is another pointer. Now you see 2 stitch lines, and that is because, let me point it out here. You see 2 stitch lines. That's because one is my stay stitching and another is my actual seam line. And when I'm coming to make the little snips in my curve, it is confusing as to which is my actual stitch line, which I should avoid cutting, and which is my stay stitching. So lesson learned is that always do your stay stitching within the seam allowance firstly, and secondly in a different color thread, so it's easy to differentiate. So for now I'm just going to avoid both lines, just to err on the side of caution. Okay, that's looking a little bit better. The moment you see your curve starting to sit a little bit better, then you know that you're making a difference. I think I could cut a little bit more here. And I find that embroidery scissors work very well for these teeny tiny curves, because they are such precise instruments. This is what I have on hand, so that's what I'm just going to use for now. And I think I'm happy with this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over to my ironing board and I'm going to just iron this. And I'm pushing the bias binding up and out of the way as I iron this, because it is going to be folded over in the next step. So off to the ironing board just to iron this in place, and I'll see you back at the workbench. So what I've done is at the ironing board I have ironed this away. And at the same time, I have flattened this out on the back and ironed it flat down. Now, a feature of bias binding is because it's cut on the bias, it does not fray. So you have two options here. The first of which is to just fold it out like this and then sew. But what that also means is that you have that raw edge. It will not fray, so it is purely up to you of whether you want to keep it this way, but if you want to fold it under, you could as well. Now the difference of which is, if you leave it open like this, you have more allowance to sew. So that means you can sew along the very edges of the binding, the seam line that you sewed earlier, and you will not see a stitch line if you do it right there. But if you were to fold it under, it means that you're going to have a stitch line running down this bound seam. So I opt for the first option. That's what I'm going to do. I am going to just pin this in place, because I'm going to show you what it looks like from the right side, and I love how it's turned out. So there's a little bit of a pucker there. I'm going to try to get rid of it with a little bit of steam iron. So remember we left a little bit of excess earlier? I have a plan for that. So this is what it looks like from the right side, and I'm liking how it looks. And what I want to do is, for a clean finish, I just want to run the row of stitches to anchor down the excess binding just here on the outside of the binding tape, the bias tape, excuse me. So what that means is, from the wrong side of your fabric, now whichever option you choose, whether you choose to leave it flat like I have or whether you choose to fold it under, what you're going to do right now is just pin all of it in place. And whenever I'm working around curves, I like to take my time, because the more love you give it, the better it's going to turn out. That's what I firmly believe. But you know what? That works for everything in life, doesn't it? Especially gardening. I have never been able to be an effective gardener, but I can sew. So if you have wonder clips that are really teeny tiny, they work perfectly around these edges as well. For now, I think I'm gonna go with pins, because I feel that they give me a little bit of a more precise grip over what I'm trying to sew. What I'm going to do before I sew the seam in is I'm going to take a quick run to the ironing board and just give it a nice press once again, just to be sure I'm very happy with how it's laying just before I actually anchor it in with a seam. So I'm just going to do right there, and I will meet you back at my sewing machine. So as you're sewing, the beginning portion is a little bit difficult. So you just want to grab hold of those thread tails from the previous stitches right about here, and just not to tug it, but so much as to gently guide it along to make sure that it is coming along just well. Okay, so I'm going to take out my pins now, run over to the sewing machine, run over to the ironing board, give it a nice press, and I'll meet you back at the workbench. So here we go. I've gone ahead and sewn that together so that it does not move around anymore. So now what I want to do is I want to follow this curve. Right, so I'm going to follow this curve and just snip all this excess off, so no more binding past this line, no more stray threads. So let's just get that out, and that is the purpose of our back stitching. That feels good because now it's nice and neat. Okay, so this is what we have now, and notice that our our basting lines that hold the two ends of the keyhole in place are within the seam allowance. Once again, the seam allowance for the neckline is going to be, as per the standard in our tutorial, a 1/2 inch. So this is sitting at about 1/4 inch. So this will be nicely encased in our neck bias binding. The keyhole is done, and what you can do next is to go ahead and affix the bias binding as per the tutorial or as per our Sewalong video earlier. So just a reminder, sew in the edges, divide it into 4, divide this into 4, and sew it in as per the tutorial. You know the drill. So here's an example. This is actually a mock-up that I sewed earlier. So this is on a spare fabric, so please ignore the rest of how it looks like and imagine that this is your Laura dress which you had drafted your keyhole onto, and let's say you don't want the teardrop keyhole that joins at the top, but you want something a little bit more open like this. It's beautiful, but how do we close up this seam? So I'm going to zoom in on the very top of the keyhole, and here we have 2 options. So you could use your regular binding, and as you would in the normal tutorial, sew all the way to the corner, but just before you reach the corner you will need to turn this under like so, fold it over, and just a little tip, a little pro tip if I may, just decrease the width of the bias binding right at the very tip, about that 1/2 inch or so that you want to turn under, and that is going to ensure that it does not pucker as you turn it under. So I'm going to show you what I mean. So I've decreased the width, I'm folding it, and then you know what, I'm just going to pop a pin there so that holds, and then I'm going to, so the idea was to decrease the width here so that it does not pop out when I fold it over. And just anchor that down with a pin. So whenever I have corners like this, I like to pin it 3 ways. One across the center, as I have done here, one diagonal to the angle that I've just created at the corner here, so that diagonal pin, and then you can continue pinning as per normal for the rest of your neckline, and of course sew that in as per the tutorial, or as you would regular binding on any curve, just like this. So that is one option in dealing with an open keyhole like this. So what if you are sewing a keyhole and you want to add a little bit of a tie right there in front? This is binding. I've used the neck binding for woven template, so it's got the exact width. And what I've done is I've lengthened it by 3 times. Of course, you can alter the length based on how long or short you want the ties in the front of your garment to be. But if for me, I like to, whenever I have ties in the front of the garment, I like to have a little enough fabric for a little bow. So that is the ultimate aim. So I have ironed this down into quarters, hence made some bias binding from it, some bias tape, and let's show you how to go ahead and do this. So fixing your bias binding in all around the neckline, and you want there to be the excess hanging down from both the edges of the keyhole. So this is what it's gonna look like. I'm going to fix this in as if it was the neckline and just pin that in place like so. And I want to take care at the corner of the keyhole. I'm going to just zoom in so you can have a little bit of a closer look as to what I'm doing. At the very tip of the keyhole, I want to make sure that it has reached the exact middle crease of my binding. Right there. And I tuck it under. So at this precise spot, I want to make sure that both edges of my binding are able to line up exactly one over another, like so. And I continue pinning all the way to the end of the binding. And at the very end, I do the same like I did before. I tuck this under, I fold it over, and of course, if you don't decrease the width of the end over there, this is what you get left with. So this is something you want to avoid. So let me zoom out so you can see how we're going to stitch this. So you would stitch the rest like the regular neckline, and then when you come over here, I like to do a little bit of a back stitch because there will be a little bit of tension at this spot as you are tying your ties. So what you're going to do as you're stitching is to just, and remember you can pin this or clip this in if you want. So as you're sewing, you just sew down that entire length just to close up the bias binding all the way to the end, and then at the very end you tuck it under and close that up. If you wish, you could add some dangly things, some tassels, some beads, whatever you fancy, just to make your Laura dress more beautiful. But this is the tutorial for adding a keyhole to the front of your Laura dress. I hope you like this hack, and we will come back with a different hack on the day that we do the hem, so stay tuned for that.